Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chayim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub. Welcome to part 2 of our year-end roundtable here on L'Chayim. Once again, I'm so pleased to be joined by a wonderful panel of guests who bring unusual insight and perspective to their analysis of the people, issues, and events that shape Jewish life today. Let me reintroduce them to you, though you know them very well by now. Stephen Bayme is the director of the Contemporary Life Department of the American Jewish Committee and the AJC's Complement Institute on American Jewish-Israeli Relations. Rabbi Eric Yoffie is President Emeritus of the Union of Reform Judaism and is a contributor to Haaretz and a frequent guest speaker and scholar in residence in communities across America. Betty Ehrenberg is the Executive Director of the World Jewish Congress of North America. And Thane Rosenbaum is Distinguished Fellow at NYU School of Law, Director of the Forum on Law, Culture, and Society at NYU, and an essayist and best-selling author whose latest novel is entitled How Sweet It Is, about 1972 Miami. Thank you all for joining me once again as we take a look back at 2015, especially as it, from your perspective, will influence the Jewish future. I want to mention two things. Then, if there's anything on any of your own lists, I would love to hear what it is. But in part one, we spoke an awful lot about the Israeli-U.S. relationship as it grew out of the Obama-Netanyahu flap. And we mentioned two things that were on the fore of your minds. One, mine too. Iran and the Iran deal, and also the events that represent the larger Islamic terrorism that we see worldwide. And you symbolized it going first by starting with Charlie Hebdo, right, and then the slaughter at the kosher supermarket in Paris. We didn't really speak, though, about what you feel the ISIS threat in general and the threat of Islamic terrorism in this battle of civilizations may mean for Jewish life in 2016 and for the State of Israel coming out of 2015. What would you say about that? To what extent do you feel, ramifications for Jewish life going forward?
One ramification, which we spent a little time on last week, was this issue of a two-state solution. If you take this ISIS jihadist phenomenon seriously, obviously Hamas and Hezbollah are not interchangeable with ISIS, but there's enough of an overlap so that what you've seen in Jerusalem over the last 9 months or so of 2015 has been just as much about a battle of religion. The Western Wall is a good example of it. In other words, which frankly was largely a matter of incitement there. In other words, Netanyahu had no plans whatsoever to transform the nature of the Western Wall, that there were some Jews that might like to have done that, but the fact is they were held under control. So that one implication is that to the extent that the Arab-Israeli conflict, or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is a political conflict, a two-state solution can be envisioned. To the extent that it's an existential religious conflict, the grounds simply aren't there. So that's one very ominous implication. Second implication obviously has to do with the future security of Jews, certainly in Europe, where you have a growing Islamic population. Again, one should not generalize about them. They come in many different shapes and sizes. But certainly 2015 witnessed an increase in the number of Muslims who basically attacked Jews because they saw themselves as, they saw Jews as irredeemably anti-Islamic or anti-Arab. As far as the United States is concerned, we have yet to see that in any concrete way. I've always been an optimist about the position of Jews in American society, namely that no society in diaspora Jewish history has been more receptive and welcoming of Jewish participation as has America. On the other hand, we should never take that for granted. In other words, are we still talking about American exceptionalism, all with this wave of terrorism that we witnessed over the last year will come to our shores as well in anti-Jewish forms?
Okay. Anything you want to add?
Well, what we've seen as a result of this terrorism is the growth, development of right-wing populism here, but also in Europe, and Hungary, and in Poland, and in Greece. And right-wing populism historically has tended towards anti-Semitic manifestations that there's some indications, surely in Hungary, for example, that phenomenon is already present. So it raises the question, will there be a reaction against terrorism that will ultimately lead to negative consequences for the Jews, apart from the threat that the Jews face from Muslims who themselves might be anti-Semitic and engage in anti-Semitic acts? So that's the first. The second is, in terms of Israel's political situation, the implications are, in fact, very unclear. And there is, in a certain sense, I think it needs to be said, Israel is stronger now in conventional military terms than it has ever been. I would suggest more secure than it has ever been, because her enemies are occupied elsewhere. And the Iranians, for example, or even Hezbollah, which is a vicious anti-Semitic organization with thousands, 100,000 rockets perhaps, even they have been careful about dealing with Israel because they are engaged in a battle on behalf of Syria, and one that has no obvious endpoint. So if you talk to Israeli military experts, they watch their enemies engaged in this process of killing each other, and they say, and in conventional military terms, they are actually in a good position. Having said that, there's a red flag. I mean, there's a certain amount of chaos, a certain amount of instability. Is ISIS, for example, going to appear in Egypt, in the Sinai, where there are already some indications of that? But in the shorter term, we should not assume that Israel is going to be weakened. I don't think that that's what's actually happened on the ground.
Okay. Do you worry that ISIS will attack Israel?
I recently was at an off-the-record meeting with a very high-ranking political figure, whose name I cannot mention, but everybody in this room would immediately know, and somebody with substantial defense experience. And what he said was, look, we're aware of the dangers that ISIS poses. ISIS does not pose a strategic threat to us, and certainly not an existential threat in any sense. He said, look, ISIS doesn't have an air force. And absent an air force, and given their current military capacities, we are not concerned about it. We are much more concerned about Assad and his air force and his conventional military capacities than we are about ISIS. Yes, it's a threat to the region. Is it a direct military threat to us? His statement flat out was right now, no.
Okay. What's your sense?
I think if it's not a threat right now, it could become a threat. We do know that there is ISIS. We do know that there is Al-Nusra, which is related in the north border of Israel. So I think that there is cause for concern. In the chaos and the meltdown of Syria, possibly Lebanon, and everybody else in surrounding Israel, there is infiltration of people that we don't know who they are, and some of them are these terrorists. So I think it's really very unclear is a good word, but I think it's a dangerous situation. I think that Abbas may have bitten off more than he could chew, because this could really boomerang at him big time. But his whole starting of this knife intifada that's going on right now started with basically the trappings of a religious war, saying that Israel wanted to, or is trying to, Judaize Al-Aqsa, which has nothing to do with territories or olive trees. This has to do with the religion. And in trying to do that, they may get sucked into all kinds of factors which have to do with ISIS, if not ISIS themselves, Al-Nusra and others, and it can become very dangerous. So I think it's a problem.
What do you think of the ISIS threat as it applies to Israel?
Well, I have 3 quick points that are related to the points that my friends have already made. One is, first of all, stating the obvious, of the four of us, these are the bigger machers than I am. So what I'm about to start saying is I actually had a dinner recently. Let's just be clear. I'm not name dropping here. These are the machers. But I happen to have been invited to a dinner recently where Ehud Barak was there. And he said something, and I might have been the only one who looked around going, did everyone just hear what he said? He said, you know, ISIS, this is further to Eric's point, he said, ISIS is a 2-month operation. He said, this is not a problem. He said, you know, Israel, any army, if you get the equivalent of boots on the ground, they don't have an air force, they have, he said, light artillery. I mean, I couldn't believe, remember, this is Israel's most decorated war hero, former IDF chief of staff, former defense minister. I wouldn't know anything about wars. He knows everything about wars, and yet he thought it's a 2-month operation. And then he ended by saying, it's just that, you know, America is afraid of boots on the ground, and that in the mindset of President Obama, every war is a 10-year war instead of a 2-month war. And I thought, wow, I haven't heard anyone say that before. That's true. The way Obama has framed Iran, everything is we don't do it because we learned what happens. You get stuck in Iraq, it takes you 10 years. So that's the first point. The second point is related to what we were saying, is that who would have ever imagined that Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia are now quasi-allies of Israel? I mean, when Eric says, you know, Israel is militarily in a stronger position, I mean, here's something we would have never imagined. Here's something Menachem Begin wouldn't have imagined. Here's something Jabotinsky wouldn't have imagined, that these three nations, given the presence of global terror and ISIS, ended up saying, look, we have a similar enemy. They're Arabs, but they're crazy Arabs, and we may not publicly proclaim our allegiance to you, but do you guys know anything in Mossad that we should know, because we need to share some information here. And then the last thing is 70 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, Jews are leaving Europe. And this, to me, is another huge story that we didn't discuss, but it's related to ISIS, it's related to global terrorism. Who would have thought? 70 years later, not because of Christian anti-Semitism. Remember, the acts, for the most part, perpetrated against the Jews of Europe are committed by Muslims who now live in Europe.
I think it's important to know that the Jews are leaving democratic countries because of ISIS. Yeah.
Right, they're leaving, and they're willing to go, and interesting with the French, they end up going to Israel, where there's at least the Iron Dome and an IDF, and a nation that has a history with dealing with terrorism, and clearly Europe is unprepared.
Yes. Will the year 2015 be seen as a watershed year in the history of European Jewry?
Well, certainly what Thane is talking about is pretty much unprecedented, certainly since World War II. So in that sense, if that trend continues, without question, it's a watershed. Realities on the ground, I think, are a bit more complicated, namely that regardless how people may feel about the situation today and their concerns, it remains very difficult to pack up, leave, move to a country where you don't have the language, where you don't necessarily have the training, so that while the numbers have increased in terms of Jews leaving, I think the ballgame is very fluid and very wide open as to how significant that trend will be. That again, there's one iron law of Jewish history, which I'll share with you here, and that is the main reason Jews move from one country to another is economic opportunity and not persecution. Persecution is a secondary reason, fear is a factor. But reality is that Jews leave for economic opportunities.
But what's interesting about this, though, Steve, and by the way, you may remember when I wrote something for the Times of Israel and I gave the number 15,000, you wrote me immediately and said, I don't think it's that high.
Right.
You said, I don't think it's ever going to be as high as you think. But one of the things that's interesting about invoking the Holocaust is to think about, well, you know, before the Holocaust, there was no precedent. There were pogroms. But it was very difficult to say to someone who owned a hat shop on Friedrichstrasse in Berlin, you know, move to your family in Brooklyn. You don't know the language. Yeah, it'll be fine. Sell the shop. Just go. Get out. It's interesting. Today we're in a globalized culture. People have the freedom of movement that's much easier than they did in the 1930s. It's globalized in every sense. And there's Israel. And yet it's interesting, Steve is still saying that, in fact, it's still hard to do. You know, for all the questioning of how come the families didn't leave Europe, you know, you would think today it would be easier to do it, and Steve is saying it's still difficult to tell people to give up on their life in Europe and move to a country that they don't know and don't speak the language.
I suggest, there was a symposium in Commentary magazine on what will be in 50 years. I suggest that in 50 years the European diaspora essentially will be gone. And I
For
think
different reasons, though.
for a whole variety of reasons. I think there won't be a single reason. But if you look at the numbers now, and you look at the political realities, and you look at where Jewish life is vibrant and attractive and so on, I think there are going to be two main centers of Jewish life. I think there'll be a relative sprinkling of Jews in France and Great Britain. But beyond that, I suspect there will not be a European diaspora.
And the main reason is?
It'll be assimilation, threats from various sources, both the right and the left, I suspect, and issues of economic opportunity. I think they will all be at play.
In 2015, after Charlie Hebdo and the kosher market, the Prime Minister of Israel basically told French Jewry, it's time for you to come to Israel. That created a great deal of controversy. How do the four of you feel about that statement by Benjamin Netanyahu?
Oh God, I think about my father's family that got stuck in Auschwitz and my mother's family that had to flee Kristallnacht, and I thank God what they would have given to hear such a statement from an
So you
Israeli
felt
Prime
positive.
Minister. Yes, I understand. So I would have hoped for a more positive response from French Jewry. However, I think what Thane and Steve have said about moving people is really very true. I have found that in meeting with Venezuelan Jewry, with other communities of Jews that we would consider endangered, it is very hard to uproot a people.
All right, we have to watch. It certainly is. I find it breathtaking to see the kind of anti-Semitism that has emerged in Western Europe, let alone Eastern Europe. It is of a different nature. It's not Christian-driven. It is Muslim-driven, but it is still in countries where we once thought, post-Holocaust, it simply wasn't going to rear its head the way it has, and it is breathtaking.
Well, it's evoked and demonstrated best by Hamas, Jews to the gas, the phrase that was uttered throughout Gaza, where crowds of people, and remember, who would have thought that a synagogue in Paris could be surrounded by a mob of 200 people throwing bottles?
Yes.
70 years. Who would have imagined?
And they weren't all Muslim.
And they weren't all Muslims. Surrounding Jews, trapped inside a synagogue in Paris.
But wait, take one moment. This is a hair off topic, but I want to hear you just address it quickly. What's your response to the way this debate is now emerging on the American scene? And there are many people who make a big deal about the fact that the President of the United States doesn't seem to want to call this kind of terrorism Islamic jihadist extremist terrorism. He calls it terrorism in a more general sense. And the question is, at the moment as we see the presidential election heating up, the primaries, to what extent will America crush ISIS? It's so interesting to hear you tell us what Ehud Barak's perspective is. But anyway, you want to speak for one moment on how you feel this whole reaction to ISIS is being played out either on the American scene in general or within American Jewish life?
Look, the ISIS issue is not can we crush ISIS. Of course we can crush ISIS. There are 30,000 fighters as far as we know. It's a defined geographic territory. Well, it's a fairly large one. The issue is what happens after we crush them. In other words, is there going to be a stable political situation that can be created there that will prevent another ISIS from arising 5 days or 5 months or 5 years down the road? Really, the shorter term is what's relevant. I mean, that's the Iraq question. We got rid of Saddam Hussein quickly. The question was, what were we able to do after that? So I'm somebody who happens to believe, first of all, I think President Obama is right to be cautious here. And second of all, every single Republican candidate, with the exception of Lindsey Graham, who's not a significant factor, has also either opposed directly or indirectly any significant boots on the ground strategy. They are all afraid of precisely and exactly that. So that's our our reality here. The question is, how do you create a stable situation in a place where it seems very unlikely that that can be done in the short term? That's the issue.
Anybody else?
Look, we do have an historical precedent here in terms of American history, and that is our failures in Vietnam. You know, we fought the wrong war in the wrong place, the wrong time. We were defeated. 1975, Vietnam became communist. We had the Carter years, which were much more neo-isolationist in the sense of not being able to crush ISIS, whatever was the equivalent in those days. Ronald Reagan, to his great credit, restored American self-confidence. Now, what we saw here, frankly, in the last 10 years, I think has been something very different. That yes, we fought another Vietnam, actually two, both Afghanistan and Vietnam and Iraq. In both cases, there's an enormous American dismay that we put so much into it and so little to show for it.
And lost so many.
And lost so many. And there is enormous reluctance to play that role again. The president has fed into this in saying things like, well, it's terrorism, it's not Islamic radicalism, or whatever is the equivalent, precisely because he wants to avoid that kind of situation. I don't necessarily agree with Eric that he did that his caution is well advised here. I think it's very debatable. I think the real question, though, is that America's long-term future must assert her primacy in international affairs. And in that respect, irrespective of one's politics, there will be a new president, 12 months from now. And I certainly hope that he or she will do that job once again, because that is America's role. We are still the only superpower around, and we have to assert ourselves as the primary player in global politics. If we don't do that, we're doing a disservice to ourselves and to our fundamental identity.
All right, speaking about elections, we had Israeli elections in 2015. And we all remember the run-up, and there was a question as to whether Netanyahu had, run his course, and it was time for somebody new. And all the people that we were seeing on JBS were telling us that it was going to be Isaac Herzog, the renamed Labor Party Zionist Union. And lo and behold, when the smoke cleared, Netanyahu, in fact, and Likud did very well, ended up with 30 seats, which was an increase for them. At the same time, Isaac Herzog becomes a major player and is now leading the opposition in the Knesset. And Moshe Kachlon in the Kulanu party emerges. And in Israel, with a multiplicity of parties in the Knesset, very often a party comes and goes in an election cycle. And so at the moment, while Naftali Bennett is still a major player, and to some extent so is Yair Lapid, all of a sudden Moshe Kachlon gets elevated, and so the names that you hear all the time are Herzog and Kachlon, and when the JFNA has their General Assembly, Isaac Herzog, as opposition leader, is invited to speak, as is Prime Minister Netanyahu. What do you make of it? Do you feel that the elections in any way were significant in terms of the year as a whole? And again, as we're looking forward to the future, do they have an impact on the Jewish future? The right-wing ultra-religious parties, once again, are part of the coalition. They get to wield a certain amount of influence. One of the things that I do want to hear you speak about is whether you think there's been any progress or any steps backwards on the issue of religious pluralism for non-Orthodox movements in Israel. But in general, how do you view the elections? And I'll remind our audience also, the last 2 days of the election, Netanyahu made some rather dramatic comments which got enormous play in the Jewish community of America. Specifically, he seemed to be saying that under no circumstances would there be a two-state solution. And number two, he sort of said to his people, the Arabs are out there voting in large numbers, and if we want to maintain control, you got to get out there too. So the way it was reported in the Jewish community here in America is, well, the prime minister is anti-two-state solution, and he's Arab racist. He has since clarified his position. I always felt it was an overstatement by the Jewish media. But having said that, these are all the things that went into the elections of this past March. And any comment on where you think it goes?
Religious disaster.
Religious disaster. Tell us.
The worst government that in my memory, and arguably the worst in Israel's history. The previous government took some modest but positive steps. I don't want to overstate.
You have Netanyahu, Lapid,
and Livni,
right?
And Lieberman.
And Naftali Bennett. I mean,
And there was a government where there were modest reforms, without going into all the details, on marriage, modest reforms on conversion, and a very significant step in terms of drafting ultra-Orthodox into the army or encouraging ultra-Orthodox
And into the job market
army
as well.
service, and also into the job market. All of those were reversed. They were flat out reversed. That was the price for the ultra-Orthodox to enter this government. So we are substantially worse off now than we were before in very specific ways. We can talk about that. I don't think it's that critical. So there are two things that I would note. There's no chance of any major progress on the religious front now. And the second point is, despite all of this, the Prime Minister of Israel gave the most pro-pluralism speech he has ever given in his life to an American audience at the GA this past year. And why did he do that? He did that because he faced a reality that was impossibly grim at a time when American Jews are increasingly angry and distraught about the absence of religious freedom. And he said, don't worry about it. I'm with you. And I'm gonna help you. I'm gonna reach out to you. He made some promises about, again, very, very small steps that may or may not be taken. But this is the dynamic now. So for those of us who see religious freedom and religious pluralism as kind of a central aspect of our pro-Zionist commitment, it's a distressing time. The politics, for now, I'll leave to the others.
Okay. What do you say about that?
well, there's no question the Prime Minister's speech to the GA is welcome. I mean, I'm glad he said it. When I was in Israel, I encountered great skepticism on both sides of the aisle as to whether any of these things will actually take place. One of the pet phrases was, how many roundtables have been formulated on the issue of religious pluralism that have not even met once? So there's a lot of skepticism. Eric's point about the current government taking steps backward is quite true. And also I'd venture to say that, again, no one I met with, either on the right or on the left, held out much hope that anything was going to change in that veneer for, say, the next 4 years, and to some extent even after, because they predict a continuing government with the religious parties. And remember, the demographics do favor the Haredi parties. What is fair to say, and this is something I've been involved with at AJC, is that for the first time, the voice of American Jewry is becoming louder on these issues. We had the Who Was the Jew affair in 1988, and then we tended to ignore it after that election. Now we're talking much more of a sustained commitment. The coalition that AJC formed has Orthodox elements within it, mainly from the modern Orthodox camp, and to some extent they're disenfranchised from the centrist Orthodox camp, and that's the subject for this program, this fine line between centrist Orthodoxy and modern Orthodoxy. But the reality is we have very prominent modern Orthodox spokespeople who are lending their efforts to this Jewish Religious Equality Coalition. I don't predict any real progress in the tangible sense. What I do predict is progress in the climate of opinion, that more and more people will be aware of these issues, more and more people will feel that the Jewish state must be a Jewish democracy, and that's what's endangered by this. And secondly, obviously, the issue that the overwhelming majority of American Jews are non-Orthodox, they're conservative and reform, and for those movements not to have recognition and standing within Israeli society raises the issues I raised last week here of to what extent is the Jewish state the state of the entire Jewish people. So again, I can't say I'm brimming over with optimism. I do think we need to continue issuing the cri de coeur. We need to continue pressuring on these issues. Ultimately, Israeli democracy will have to work itself out, but with a helping hand by the voice of American Jewry as a critical component of what it means to be part of the Jewish people.
You know, Betty, there are people who argue, both in the American Jewish community and in Israel, that if American Jews want Israel to become Jewishly pluralistic as we have here in America, more American-type pluralistic Jews have to move to Israel and make Aliyah. And that was Ben Gurion's comment, by the way. You want to be equal here? Bring 100,000 people here and it'll change. To what extent do you feel that on the Israeli scene itself, among the Sabra Israeli people, there's not enough of a concern that this particular dimension of the problem of a coalition government, namely small ultra-religious parties, end up with a disproportionate amount of influence and power, that ultimately it doesn't bother Israelis enough for the situation to change?
I don't think this particular issue bothers Israelis enough. I think they are concerned about, they will tell you they are concerned about influence of small religious parties for other reasons and in other areas.
Right, they care about the army and they care about the
they
workforce.
They do, but I think that reform will come from Israelis on issues that are important for them. I think that reform on this will also come from the Israelis as well. So I don't think Ben Gurion was being glib in saying, well, come over here and you'll vote. But there's some truth to that because, I find that Israelis in general don't really have enough of an awareness of American Jewish life in toto, not only the way we identify with synagogues and via religious streams, but even with many, many things. And I'm always marveling how a shaliach, whether it's a shaliach kihilati in the JCC or a shaliach from the foreign ministry in a consulate or a shaliach for the Jewish agency, they come here, they spend a couple of years here, they become very interested and maybe even very influenced, and they're very determined to go home and teach about the American Jewish community. They go home, they land in Ben Gurion Airport, somebody must be standing there spraying them with something because immediately they forget about it. And all these, can I think of years and years of all these Israeli shlichim who have vowed this, have come and nothing has happened. So we don't find that the Israeli press really covers American Jewish life either. So I think that you'll begin to see change in this area, in the religious area, and in other areas when it becomes important to Israelis themselves.
So far, nobody has addressed the political ramifications and the upset that was expressed in the Jewish community with Netanyahu. Do you have any perspective on this?
Well, when you reminded us of that anecdote about those elections, the first thought I had was my friend Steve Bayme again, because the first thing he said earlier today was, this is what keeps me up at night, the demographic problems. And so I said, yes, this was typical for Bibi Netanyahu, inartfully done, but he was expressing his own sense of trepidation and sleeplessness of saying, we are a functioning democracy, and there's a danger in a functioning democracy. That means that, the more Arabs you have may become elected officials, members of the Knesset, and take positions that you will will come to regret. That's the risk that democracies take, and I think that it's really, Steve uttered the phrase with more subtleness than how boorishly it came out. The second thing is, this was an election that was decided by the Iran deal. I mean, it's not even clear to me Netanyahu might have even been reelected without the Iran deal. I think that in the same way that George W. Bush was reelected in 2004, he's a wartime consigliere. And then the last thing is, going to Betty's point, this ongoing religious influence within Israeli government here's where Eric and I absolutely agree, an utter disaster, because the diaspora needs to be able to do what people like us do. I know when I speak at universities to say, how many of you here believe in women's rights? How many of you here believe in rights for homosexuals? How much, Israel needs to continue to show itself as a profoundly pluralistic nation. We have to be able to make that case. Israel's PR problems are bad enough as it is. If in fact when you hear stories of what Lieberman says about Arabs, or what you hear about the anecdotes of, girls singing in certain areas of Jerusalem get beaten up by religious people, this is the utter public relations disaster, that Israel begins to look like a fundamentalist religious Jewish nation instead of what we believe it to be, a vibrant, pluralistic nation under the principles of liberal democracy.
First of all, the comment was a terrible comment. The Arabs are voting in hordes. They're taking them on buses to vote. Imagine the President of the United States saying that about blacks or Hispanics and how we would respond. Now, such things happen. He apologized for it, but I'm not prepared to dismiss it as being acceptable. It's not acceptable.
Does everybody agree?
I have a second point.
Yeah, hold a second point.
I said he was boorish. It's
Yeah.
not my favorite sentence.
Yeah, look, the comment was, I did not like the comment at all. Frankly, I was appalled by it. But Herzog, had he had a numerical ascendancy in terms of
Yes.
numbers, he would have been given the first chance to form
Yes.
government. He would have cut whatever deals he needed to make, especially with the ultra-Orthodox. Herzog may be an iconic figure among a lot of people, but
And Kachalon would have gone with him instead of
Exactly.
going with
Of course.
Netanyahu.
Exactly, yeah.
Right.
So in that respect, Netanyahu snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. I can't say I'm his greatest fan, but I would hardly tar him with the brush that others tarred him with as being racist.
And I'll tell you what my problem is. And I want to say it gently, but then I really do want to hear what your answer is. When you make an analogy to, can you imagine an American president saying it about blacks or Latinos, whatever? There's no community inside America that wants to destroy America. It's not like blacks or Latinos are anti-American. There's a reality here. It's a very complicated reality for Israel. Israel has done this remarkable thing of trying to give civil rights and political rights to people who want to destroy the polity. That's normally not done. That's normally called sedition. Normally, you don't get to celebrate the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence with on the same date where you're basically saying it's the worst thing that ever happened in the history of the world. You normally don't have people in America who are given the opportunity in Congress to say, 9/11 was a pretty good thing to have happen. Now, Israel, to its enormous credit, has said, look, this is an Arab community that we have to be respectful of. We wish that they would love the state of Israel. They don't. And so we're going to give them enormous latitude. So there is a full party in the Israeli Knesset of Arab coalition that on a routine basis speaks about the annihilation of the state of Israel. And it seems to me that in that context, for Netanyahu to say, I just want you to be aware that at the moment there is a real concerted effort among Arab Israelis to get out the vote. And I didn't find it objectionable. I didn't find it racist. I found it rather politically astute. And given the reality, it didn't offend me. So we do see it differently, but I really want to hear how you, if my perspective at all softens the way you feel.
Two points to be made. We're talking about people who are citizens of the state of Israel.
Absolutely.
And we are talking about people who, over the course of modern Israeli history, have not been treated the way that they should have been treated, have not been granted the rights that they should have been granted.
The rights?
The rights.
Oh, I agree with you that they're treated as second-class citizens.
Until 1963.
66.
Was it 66? They
Under
were
military occupation.
They were under military occupation, did not have the rights of Israeli citizens. And more significant for now is you can look at the numbers. I mean, the Knesset just did its own survey in terms of the services provided to Arab municipalities as opposed to the services provided to Jewish municipalities. That can be measured in dollars. And the truth of the matter is the Arabs have been discriminated against.
Absolutely.
In a significant way.
Yes.
In a significant way.
I don't disagree.
Which is contrary to the desire to integrate them and overcome some of the outrageous political behavior that you see to some extent from Arab citizens and certainly from their political representatives. My conclusion is, if he wanted to make a political point, he could have made it in a language that did not suggest the possibility that it was motivated by racist sentiments. There was no need for it. And I think he did it intentionally, precisely for the reasons that Steve said. In other words, he had to be the biggest party. Therefore, he had to get votes from Bennett and from Lieberman. And Lieberman talks about Israeli Arabs in the most dismissive way possible, really maybe going over the line of racism. Netanyahu had to appeal to those parties if he was going to be the largest one and was going to be able to form the government. And I think he intentionally chose that kind of a formulation because he was desperate and he was afraid he was going to lose. So in any case, I'm distressed when the head of the Jewish state, who is in a sense my leader, uses that kind of language.
Okay. Anybody else want to weigh in on this, or am I sitting here alone on it?
I hope people heard again. I think we should rewind the tape on Golub.
Are you saying to me that in 1948, Arabs who were inside Israel were not given citizenship?
They were under military occupation until 1966.
Even in Israel?
That's right. It was removed in 66, a year before the Six-Day War.
Right.
And the overall trajectory since then has been towards greater equality. Not always perfect, but look, Ehud Olmert, I think, put it beautifully back when he was mayor of Jerusalem. He said, a democratic state cannot afford second-class status, even for people, or especially for people whom I disagree with entirely.
Okay, let me ask you in a different way. At the moment, Israeli Arabs do have the right to vote.
Yes, it's the issue of services now.
They do have a party in the Knesset.
Right.
There is a Supreme Court justice
There used to
who's
be
an
two.
Arab Israeli.
There used to be two at the
Okay,
same time.
it's not, and Bo, nobody should argue.
They serve in the foreign ministry.
Nobody, and they are judges, they are lawyers, they are doctors. When I was in Shaare Tzedek Hospital, the best nurse I had was an Arab Israeli. Okay, but no one should argue that you'd like to be an Israeli Arab any more than at the moment, even in America today, you want to be black. It is better to be white in America. It's better to be a Jew in Israel. At the same time, it is not as if there are not real steps Israel takes to try to move towards a more just society. There are NGOs, Israelis are in NGOs that are working for Israeli Arab rights, even more, it seems to me, than indigenous Arab Israelis are working for Arab Israeli rights. I don't know the equivalent of the NAACP in the Arab world in Israel.
There are no Arabs anywhere in the Arab world who have a standard of living and the amount of freedom that Israeli Arabs have. All that I'm saying here is when one of our own does something unfortunate and, in my view, wrong, perhaps we need simply to be able to say that rather than suggesting there are 100 reasons why this isn't serious.
Well, but maybe it isn't serious. And also, it wasn't just it was wrong. He was vilified. I talked to American Jews who, as far as they were concerned, Netanyahu now was the scum of the earth. I don't think. Also, I don't know how it sounded in Hebrew. Do you know? Can you tell me? Because very often, the way it's
vicious.
Did it sound vicious?
It sounded vicious. It was not a nice comment that was taken out of context.
It doesn't sound nearly as vicious as some of the comments that the members of Knesset from the Arab parties
Well
are
said.
making in the
Absolutely.
Knesset,
Well said, Debbie.
abroad,
Absolutely.
in other countries.
Right, Debbie.
I'm
that
not
are,
denying that.
are
We're making
treasonous.
excuses,
You go,
though.
girl.
In other words, if we respond to every such incident by saying, they're worse, that's not my Zionism. They're worse than we are. Well, this might have been bad, but aren't they worse? Let's focus on how they're worse than we are. That's not the Zionism.
Worse in an academic
No,
sense.
no, that's not what I
Worse
mean.
in a practical reality of this is the politics of that region.
The Prime Minister of the Jewish state does not have to talk that way. You know, we haven't talked about the European sanctions, the labeling process.
Labeling products made in the West Bank.
Made in the territories.
The
So,
iterations of BDS. It's very
right. So the question is, will this lead to additional steps of one kind or another by Europe that will, I mean, they're not going to adopt a BDS approach, at least not in the foreseeable future, but there are a whole range of steps that they might conceivably take. I think that's a real concern.
This year was the 20th anniversary of the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin.
It's on my list.
Okay.
We agree.
That to me is a watershed event for several reasons. Number one, it demonstrated the reality of an incredibly strong religious nationalist movement within Israel, who again, if the demographics are correct, that's where society is going. And that to me is quite ominous. There's a movie that came out, I don't know if it was this year or the previous year, which I really wouldn't recommend. It's called The Gatekeepers. 5 former Mossad agents talking publicly, and I have all sorts of issues with it. But there's 8 minutes in that film that's well worth reviewing. 8 minutes of the anti-Rabin sentiment on the West Bank in the days and months leading up to the assassination. You had 8-year-old children with hatred in their eyes saying, "B'dam va'esh et Rabin negaresh." In blood and fire, we will banish Rabin. Sounds better in Hebrew, perhaps, or it sounds more poetic. That's a trend that is very frightening, especially when hatred is being transmitted to 8-year-olds.
Do you feel it's growing?
I think the demographics clearly are growing. We are witnessing, we've seen in the last year, attacks on Palestinians on the West Bank, including the burning of a home and a family, exactly. Yeah, I'd be very concerned about it. And I wish Israeli leadership, certainly the educational leadership, be taking a much stronger stance in that regard. And the religious educational leadership, the real challenge to them as to what they're teaching.
Hold on. Any comment on this?
I don't think it's growing. I think these are reprehensible, abhorrent, isolated incidents. I don't think Israel is rife with these things, so it's very important, I think, to point out.
And they also evoke universal condemnation throughout the Jewish world.
Yes, which is connected to, I think I would expand a little bit on the labeling issue and on the BDS, because I think it's all connected. I think the labeling issue in Europe will have wider repercussions on BDS in other countries, in other areas, which will have repercussions on campus, which is why I think we should be careful how we discuss these incidents and make sure that, again, we're not painting Israel with a broad brush of something, because this lends itself to it, and I think we have to be careful. But I think we're going to still see, you asked about things trending into 2016. We've not seen the end of BDS. We've not seen the end. The labeling can start as something that's relegated to the territories, but it can be extended easily to something that boycotts Israel. And I think what we see on campus, or what we saw in Israel demonstrations in Europe during the Gaza confrontation, and it wasn't just about Israel, but they did say Jews to the gas or death to the Jews. So it's always a fine line, and it always seems to cross over. And I think we still have to be very worried about that.
By the way, one of the things that I have heard people worry about, I don't know if it is a legitimate worry or not, is that there is a growing readiness or a articulation within the Israeli public, especially young Israelis, of a certain kind of hatred of Arab Israelis and Arabs in general and Palestinians, which has not been typical. And I talk to Israelis all the time here on JBS. I talk to them not only in studio, but in the field. I will often ask young Israelis, some of whom have had horrible experiences in the IDF and have lost friends and brothers and sisters. Do you hate Palestinians? Steve, they look at me as if I'm crazy, that the question makes no sense to them. And that's been my experience with adults and young people, that in general, while I would not be surprised if Israelis really were frightened to the extent that they hated the enemy, I normally don't run across it. And yet I'm being told by other people that there is more hatred being expressed in Israel than there has been in the past. I'm asking the four of you, what do you hear? What might you know? And in some ways, an outgrowth of the point you just made. Any comment?
If you focused your surveying on hilltop youth, I think the answers you would get would be far more disturbing.
And hilltop refers to?
These wildcat settlements where
beyond the settlement.
well beyond the Green Line.
Right.
Legal outposts.
Outposts. When they are removed by the army, they pack their bags.
All right, but these are sort of the crazies in our community.
They're young people. They're taking action that speaks eloquently for what their aims are, in the sense of they're creating facts on the ground. The government, by its own admission, has not dealt with them adequately. I worry about a trend like that. I certainly hope it can be contained. I hope that Betty's correct that these are isolated incidents. It's interesting, Betty, we had one in 2014 with the kidnapping and one in 2015 with the burning. Well, we didn't see any of that in 2013. So an increase from 0 to 2 is a pretty
Yes,
big
I
increase.
know.
But it's one a year, you're saying.
One a year, but bottom line is we didn't see this a
And
while
you do
ago.
feel, by the way, that there is an extraordinary explosion of criticism and condemnation throughout the Jewish world, yes?
I think that's largely true, except perhaps in the right-wing circles of Orthodoxy, where I do not hear it.
All right. Either of you want to comment on this issue?
There's the whole Tag Mechir phenomenon.
Price tag.
Phenomenon, which generally involves vandalism, hooliganism, individual physical attacks, uprooting olive trees, that kind of thing. And generally speaking, does not involve killing people.
Yes.
But,
and again, I'm asking you to speak up this in the context that we're about to enter 2016.
The point
what
is,
should our audience be worried for or watch for?
After the Wapsha family was murdered,
Yeah.
if you followed the Israeli press, it was very interesting. Story after story, we didn't generally see it here, was the intelligence authorities acknowledging that they did not have a handle on this. And to follow up on Steve's comment, that there had been these groups, they didn't have sufficient personnel, they didn't have orders from above to deal with it, and it had gotten out of hand. And they were accepting responsibility and saying these policies need to change. So that was positive, and now what we hope to see is that, in fact, Israeli intelligence and Israeli authorities will deal with this so it disappears and doesn't grow, because if it were to grow, it would be very serious, a terrible blot on Israel's name.
If it were to grow.
If it were to grow.
Okay. You said there were two things.
Yeah. One issue, I think, has enormous implications for the future that we've not begun to unpack. It goes back to 2013 with the Pew Study. Whatever remembers about the Pew Study is assimilation, the shrinking Jewish middle, but there is another story in the Pew Study, and that is the ascending importance of Orthodoxy. What we saw in 2015, which, again, we had only seen glimmers of earlier, was the centrist Orthodox establishment. Put aside the ultra-Orthodox establishment. But the centrist Orthodox establishment, the Rabbinical Council of America, to a lesser extent the OU, and to an even lesser extent Yeshiva University, although voices from within both those groups, were busy condemning the actions of the so-called open Orthodox leadership, particularly the Shivat Maharat, which is, without question, a full-blown rabbinical school for women, and Shivat Chovei Torah, which is a rabbinical seminary designed more along the lines of the West European rabbinical seminaries than the East European yeshivot.
And that's Avi Weiss.
That's Avi Weiss, exactly. Now, as a human being and as an Orthodox Jew, I said, these are institutions that ought to be applauded. This is the third one, by the way, the International Bet Din, was headed up by Rabbi Simcha Kraus, which is trying to nullify the entire issue of agunot, to prevent there being a single woman who is a chained woman without a bill of divorce. You have these three institutions trying to strengthen Jewish life, precisely in an age of assimilation. In other words, when we really should be worried about assimilation, the centrist Orthodox leadership has nothing better to do than to issue condemnations of what's taking place here. It's an incredibly misguided sense of priorities, number one. But number two, in terms of looking to the future, what I think we're looking at is a challenge to what I call the truly modern Orthodox to stand up and be counted, to establish their verve and independence, and not keep on looking over their right shoulder. A challenge the centrist Orthodox to ask themselves, do we have to agree with everything in order to accept it, tolerate it, even give it a blessing? It seems to me that the forces within centrist Orthodoxy are so intent on delegitimating the forces to their left, which, by the way, is a misnomer then. A centrist group means, yes, I have people on my right and people on my left. What the centrists are doing is saying we have plenty of room on the right, but we have no room on the left. I think you're going to see much more friction on those grounds in the year ahead. My hope is that the modern Orthodox will stand up and be counted. This has enormous implications for the rest of the Jewish world because the modern Orthodox are the bridge group between Orthodoxy and the liberal movements, as reflected in the coalition I spoke about earlier in terms of religious pluralism in Israel. My fear, obviously, is that the centrist Orthodox establishment is so strong that the members of the modern Orthodox group will feel disenfranchised, essentially threatened with loss of their positions or becoming marginalized, and will essentially fold up their tents. I certainly hope that doesn't happen, and I certainly intend to devote some of my own energies to making sure it doesn't happen. But I think it's a real prospect.
Okay. This is the second time you've mentioned this in a roundtable, and again, it is worthy in 2016 of a program in and of itself. Simply as somebody who comes out of the leadership of the Reform movement, any comment at all?
Look, the Orthodox world, I think, is moving in the direction of Haredi practice and belief. I mean, Steve is talking about the centrist modern split and so on. I think the broader picture, if you look at the Orthodox world, is a larger percentage of the Orthodox world now is Haredi than was the case 5 years ago and 10 years, 20 years ago.
It's 2/3 of the Orthodox population.
And
growing.
So that is becoming the Orthodox reality, and that has all kinds of implications. Short term, I mean, there was just a study that came out, last week or two on poverty in Israel. There are two populations. There's the Arab population. That relates to what we were saying before. You can integrate them. They can't all be poor. And the other population is ultra-Orthodox, where depending on which commentator you were reading, suggests that among the ultra-Orthodox, the poverty rate is between 55 and 60%. Again, absolutely unacceptable. They're a larger part of the population. My own view is that's fine. The Jewish state. Why shouldn't we have a healthy Haredi minority? But the point is, too many of them are not working and are poor. That's beginning to change a little bit. I think we need to acknowledge that. This is a huge priority for Israel. Grade 1, a majority of grade 1 students in the state of Israel are non-Zionist. And when I say non-Zionist, I mean, first of all, that's how they define themselves. And second of all, they don't serve in the army. So, in other words, Arabs and ultra-Orthodox make up a majority of grade 1 students in the state of Israel.
Isn't that scary?
The implications for that are deeply and profoundly troubling. How can you have a majority of that sector that's not committed to army service when you live in one of the most dangerous places in the world? So the point is, we need to integrate both populations, and we need to find a way to do it. So we have to make sure the ultra-Orthodox go to work. I also believe they should serve in the army because that would facilitate this process of getting them to work. But, here I would turn to Netanyahu and the leadership of Israel and say, where is this on the agenda exactly? Mm-hmm. Why aren't you talking about this?
Mm-hmm. But it is on the agenda.
And what are you doing about it?
But it is on the agenda.
But not enough. For those numbers would be way better than they currently are.
I would like to tell you that there are numbers, and nobody covers them, nobody speaks about them, you don't hear about them, but there are hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands already, in the Nachal Haredi, or the Haredi sector of the Israeli army. And they're not at desk jobs, or what they call in Israel jobnikim. They are in Kfir, which is a unit that runs after terrorists, and other similar units, but nobody wants to talk about it. What I do hear about complaints among secular Israelis very often is, oh my God, they're more Orthodox now in the office, amongst the officers and the elites. That's terrible, because they see that as encroaching upon them. And I really
It's
hear
terrific.
that in
It's
Israel.
not terrible.
Well, I think it's also wonderful, but we have to, the thing that, what I'm saying is that it's not admired and covered means that no one hears about it and no one knows about it, so people think it's not on the agenda. This particular prime minister, I will tell you, had a very good solution and implemented a very good solution in Bnei Brak, for example, to have women open small businesses instead of all the women becoming teachers and all the men going to study, which is an impossible situation. And he opened a small business administration, and this was put into force, and now you have businesses in Bnei Brak, which is really an admirable thing. No one heard about it, no one knows about it. I'm sure I'm telling people things that they don't know. There is an increasing awareness in Israel on the part of the Haredi community to learn computers and to be integrated in the workforce there. It's beginning to dawn on a lot of people that this current situation financially is just untenable, and it's not going to be able to be continued. Likewise, and this is what I wanted to mention before, I'm happy to see here in the United States, in New York specifically, young Haredim Haredim who have been through schools that have not adequately educated them and prepared them for work now complain about it and openly discuss it. And you've read about it in the New York Times. There's even a lawsuit or two on the part of young Haredim who felt that their schools have not taught them mathematics and science and whatever it is they need to know to get along in the real world. So I think there are some very good signs, and they should. And I think that points to some progress. The issue that Steve raised, I really would like to comment on. I've never heard it differentiated between centrist Orthodox and modern Orthodox. I guess I consider myself modern Orthodox, and I never would consider myself not a centrist Orthodox. So I guess there are two. I met a girl in my shul who told me she was an MOM. I said, "What's an MOM?" "I'm a modern Orthodox machmir." Really strict. I said, I never heard of that in my life. So what I would like to point to is that I think that there is an underlying problem with the splintering in the modern Orthodox community, and that worries me very, very much. And I wish that I think that in light of that, the modern Orthodox community, I feel, is getting smaller. It is getting smaller. It needs to be the bridge. It was always the bridge in Israel, and it was always a bridge here. And I'm wary of issues that divide it, and I really think something has to be done. We tried to do things in the past in the modern Orthodox community to have a dialogue about this with the different modern Orthodox Jewish organizations, and I think it needs to be resuscitated and spoken about again to try and prevent any further splintering. As I said before, we're very splintered all across the board, and anything that just contributes to that is very unhelpful.
Okay. I want to ask the four of you what you think about the fact you talked about the anniversary, the 20th anniversary of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. This year was also the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate. Speak for a moment about what you feel the importance of that document was. And the Catholic Church just came out with another decision that is now, in essence, banning Catholics from trying to convert Jews to Catholicism, so that there's a continuing movement here, a strengthening of relationship people see between the Vatican and the Jewish people. And Nostra Aetate is a signature moment in that development. The 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, explain that to our audience and then comment on it.
Nostra Aetate is part of Vatican II consultations. The Church issued a statement after extensive deliberations involving people like Abraham Joshua Heschel, my colleague, the late Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum of AJC, and a ton of other people, to the effect that not all Jews living in Palestine in the first century, or in the world of the first century, should be tarred with the brush of deicide, and certainly not all Jews today. In other words, this happened 2,000 years ago. I must say, when it came out, I remember I was 15 years old at the time, I gave a ho-hum, because I said, why would anyone think that all Jews living in first century Palestine, let alone in Spain, would be guilty of the crime of deicide? It involved a relatively small number of people. And number two, as I said, who in their right mind would think of collective punishment 2,000 years later? I came to realize the importance of Nostra Aetate as I reflected back upon something that happened in 1963, 2 years earlier. I grew up in Boston, which is a very heavily Catholic town, and my way to school involved going past through the main Catholic area. Essentially, I passed by a church, and I saw a young man, more or less my age. He spotted my kippah, and immediately he gave a cross on his heart, as if to say, don't tar me with that brush. What Nostra Aetate has meant is fundamental change in in Catholic education, meaning the teaching of contempt was removed from Catholic textbooks. The entire approach between Catholics and Jews has sharply been enhanced through the efforts of, obviously, Pope John the 23rd, but through his successors, especially the long tenure of Pope John Paul II. We have a lot to celebrate with Nostra Aetate, because what it really signals is that the centuries-long, millennia-long perception of Jews as somehow or other the cursed people, which was the language used back in the Crusades. They're the people that are cursed forever because they rejected Christ. That language has disappeared. 50 years later, we have a statement saying, we should not be engaging in the missionizing of the Jews. That's a major step forward. Now, again, I haven't lost too much sleep over how many Jews converting to Catholicism because of proselytizing activity. But for the church to go on record as saying that the covenant of the Jews is a legitimate covenant, it continues, we have no business trying to persuade them to join our covenant, I regard this as to be categorical and say it's an unadulterated blessing. Obviously, there may be points of contention at one point or another, but the overall image is that this is a major step forward. It has been for 50 years, and we should be celebrating it.
Any thoughts?
Well, given the annihilationist language that we hear out of the Islamic world against Jews, imagine what Jewish life would be like today without Vatican II and Nostra Aetate. I mean, right now, because of Nostra Aetate, and I quite agree with Steve that this was the proverbial game changer in terms of Catholic-Jewish relations. It really cleared the field for true interfaith dialogue and a sense of true brotherhood of two religions evolving out of the same doctrine. And now we're facing something far worse, far more threatening. And we are screaming for a Mecca too, something that would be the equivalent of reform within the Islamic teachings.
So I still want to hear from you speak for a moment about the future of Jewish leadership as we end 2015 and begin 2016. And the reason that I ask it specifically is because in 2015, we saw the retirement of two national Jewish leaders. One was an iconic figure, Abe Foxman, retires at the ADL, and Steve Gutto retires after 10 years at the JCPA. Abe Foxman is going to be replaced by Jonathan Greenblatt, and Steve Gutto is going to be replaced by David Bernstein. These are people you all know. You all know them. These are people you've known and worked with. Again, Abe Foxman was, and by the way, although Abe Foxman is now no longer the formal director, national director of ADL, he's still emeritus and he's still involved and he's not going away, but he doesn't occupy the same role. And now Jonathan Greenblatt is the person you look to at the ADL. It's in some way the beginning of the changing of the guard, because when you look at Jewish life, there have been certain iconic figures who have grown in stature. We have Ron Lauder at World Jewish Congress. You've got David Harris at AJC, and you had Abe Foxman at ADL, et cetera, et cetera. You had Eric Yoffie. For how long were you with URJ?
16 years.
Okay. But there is a changing of a generation in some sense here. And since, again, this happened to you, only a couple of years ago, just, what are your thoughts as you think about Abe Foxman and Steve Gutto as a younger guy? It's a different model. But Abe Foxman represents, a generational change in Jewish leadership. You have Malcolm Hoenlein at the President's Conference. And in some way, I never want to see any of these guys go, And at the same time, that's not how life works. And you hope that the next generation of leaders comes in. But they're coming in with a different perspective and a different background. And Rick Jacobs takes over for you. He's doing a wonderful job within the URJ.
Yes.
But, speak for a moment. Anything you want to say at all about the transition, Abe Foxman, Steve Gutto,
Abe
et cetera?
Foxman's retirement, I think, is worthy of note. He played a unique role in the American Jewish community. And he was an organizational leader. He was a rabbinical leader. But he was an organizational leader who was recognized in virtually all corners of the Jewish organizational world. And in many ways, he was the spokesman to the President of the United States, the leaders of America, as much as they took into account all of the other organizations and all the rest of us who served in one capacity or another. To some extent, you went to Abe Foxman if you wanted a formal connection, if you wanted to both express a view or to listen to what was being said in the Jewish world. Now, what's interesting is he represented an organization that was concerned about anti-Semitism. And over the course of his time, there were There were ups and downs, although on balance, anti-Semitism became less of an issue. So what I wonder as we look to the future, 10 years now, 20 years now, 30 years now, will it be a less important position? Because the issue around which that position is built will in and of itself become less significant in America.
Yes.
And the answer is, I don't know. And beyond that, as you said, look, it's the natural course of things. Leaders come and go. I believe in the ability of the American Jewish community to produce high-quality leaders. And finally, what I yearn for, and that I don't see right now, is a Heschel. Taking somebody clearly not from my movement, not from my movement, but a Heschel. In other words, a spiritual force, someone's learned in Torah, who has a certain measure of authority and recognition throughout the Jewish world, and can speak from that perspective of Torah learning to the issues of the day. Heschel was extraordinary in that regard. There have been a few others who've been able to do it, but it happens very rarely, and I'm not sure that I see the young Heschels right now who are on the scene.
Yeah, but is there a rabbinic figure that you feel sort of transcends whatever movement he comes out of, or she comes out of, who really has a national presence?
Well, certainly Yitzhak Greenberg filled that role in a post-Heschel era. He became the rabbi of the Federation world, and as a result was able to address all sectors of the community. Does he have an heir? I don't see one on the horizon right now, but certainly he filled the role that Eric.
But if you're talking, maybe if you're speaking only about the United States, but I'm beginning to see a lot of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs in many, many countries, and that's new because he just retired from the position in Great Britain. So, but I would like to just say one more thing. I mean, I think sometimes organizations change. I don't know if I saw Abe Foxman so unique in terms of the ADL. Don't forget there was Nate Perlmutter of the same type who came before him, and Arnie Foster, so that the new person that they have, Jonathan Greenblatt, is seen as somewhat seen as a departure in some way, and that has to do with what the lay leadership in the organization has.
By the way, they did not promote from within.
That was different.
That's what I'm saying. It's a departure.
Speak to that for a moment, because people should understand. That was your point.
Yes.
Normally, we would have expected ADL to take somebody who had been groomed from within ADL, and they didn't.
So the question is, how does the lay leadership of the ADL see itself, and what do they see their role to be in the future? I think David Bernstein at JCPA now is different than Steve Gotow and different than Larry before him, and maybe different from Al Chernin. But don't forget, Al Chernin lived in another time, and we had different concerns.
It was called NACRAC at the time.
And it was called NACRAC, meant inside there were the National Jewish Community Relations Advisory Council, and we put the emphasis on Jewish community relations. That was the importance then. Did the fact that they changed their name to Jewish Council for Public Affairs indicate that they saw themselves more of a think tank than a community relations body? I don't know. Certainly we need a community relations body, and to a certain extent I hope they've remained a Jewish community relations body. But I do think that we don't like change terribly much, especially within of leaders that we depend on, that we have confidence in, that make us feel secure. And but it always seems to me, and I would, even though maybe it is cliched, Eric, but I really do think we will have leadership. We will have leadership in the future, and it happens. Look, I don't know how many people thought with the demise of Stephen Wise that we would ever see a leader like that again. In World Jewish Congress, Edgar Bronfman stepped down. There was a void, and what did we think was going to happen? And we're very fortunate we have Ronald Lauder, who is different, but very, very effective in many ways, and certainly making inroads in Europe that many people would have never thought possible. So there are Tom Dine stepped down at AIPAC, and he was very much admired and very highly respected. And Howard Core has ably filled the shoes. So I don't think we should, worry.
Okay. Your sense?
Look, there's always the debate among historians: do Do the times make the person, or does the person make the times? The kind of people that Eric was talking about, Betty mentioned Stephen Wise, Eric mentions Heschel. They also were living in an era of what might be called Jewish self-confidence in terms of the position of Jews in the post-Holocaust era. They were living in a time of optimism. That fueled the Jewish involvement in civil rights, which was a very central component of how we defined ourselves in the 1960s. What happened, I would say probably 1975 became a critical date because that was the date of the passing of Zionism's racism resolution. A change of paradigm took place in the Jewish world, obviously focused around Israel, that could be called the sense of the world is ganging up on us. Cynthia Ozick, a very respected intellectual, wrote a piece at the time, which I took strong exception to, but it was called, I think it was Esquire magazine, it called All the World Hates the Jews. That resulted in a leadership that was far more defense-oriented. AJC used to call itself a human relations agency. Today we call ourselves global Jewish advocates. In other words, the change in language is reflective of a much more defensive mindset. My problem with that, just intellectually, is that if you're going to be serious about assimilation and countering assimilation, you've got to have a positive reason to be Jewish, and not that the world is against you. But the mindset of this generation is very much of, we have nothing more important to be doing than to be defending the Jewish people. Obviously, I don't dissent from that position, but I think the challenge to this new generation you're talking about, whether it's David Bernstein at JCPA and Jonathan Greenblatt at ADL, and whoever succeeds David at AJC, and Malcolm Henline at the Conference of Presidents, I think the challenge is going to be, it's not enough to have an ideology of survivalism. One needs an ideology of why be Jewish, and certainly politics can never be a substitute for identity. And to some extent, if you want to give a throwback to that, Abba Hillel Silver is remembered as a fantastic Zionist, and he was. What people have forgotten completely is that he was probably the single most effective rabbi in Cleveland. Certainly he had a major following there. I still meet people who swear by him then. That's the kind of leadership that's necessary, and God willing, we will discover it in due time.
Okay. Are you worried for it?
Look, what is the book of Ecclesiastes puts it, dor olech v'dor bav, aretz l'olam amadet, meaning a generation comes, generation goes, the world stands still. Along came the Copernican revolution, and people said it was against the Torah because it suggested that the world was not standing still. My gut feeling is that people evolve, organizations evolve. I worked for many years under Bert Gold. His approach to a Jewish life was much more consensual-based in terms of AJC. You really heard strong statements, outspoken statements by him. David Harris, who I've worked with, I've reported to now for 25 years, has always been a very strong spokesperson for what should be. The models will evolve over time, with each organization finding its own distinctive culture. I think the real question or the real challenge to us is, as Jewish life is threatened by assimilation, will we have enough of a critical mass of Jews, particularly within the conservative reform movements, who are prepared to pick up the cudgels of Jewish activism on behalf of the Jewish people?
It has been wonderful to share these two programs with you.
No persons of the year?
Oh, yes, give me two. Who's the Jewish person of the year?
Not Jewish. Lassan Batili, the Malian born Muslim who saved 15 people at the Hiper Kasher grocery store. Alberto Nisman. President Macri in Argentina.
Yes.
Who is undoing the Memorandum of Understanding. Yes. And the IDF in the Israeli hospitals for rescuing and treating over 2,000 Syrian refugees.
Fabulous. Did you come up with somebody?
I didn't, but can I jump to something else?
Yes.
Because you also asked another question, which was a cultural moment of some significance. And Steve will know what I'm talking about here, because I think it's important. The revival, yet again, of Fiddler on the Roof is coming back to Broadway. And the reason this is important is because I think there's a large segment of the American community that forgot that Jews were once immigrants. That immigrant past has been lost, about where, Jews are now rich white people. They're privileged. They're colonialists in the Middle East. And, for people who don't know their history, and most people don't, there has been, I think, a misunderstanding of Jews were immigrants in this country and in other countries around the world. And Fiddler on the Roof, in all of its, cheesiness, and there's many things one can say about it, but it is a reminder of the traditions that the Jewish people always had, and their efforts to always preserve them amidst approaching assimilation and threats. And yes, here we still are, but this is how we started out, not this way. We had to get to this position.
Beautifully said. It opened last Sunday, and it's the 50th anniversary of its first showing, starring, of course, Zero Mostel, and Sheldon Harnack, the Tony Award-winning lyricist, is still alive, was with us on L'Chayim this past week. So yes, it is playing at the Broadway Theater on Broadway. Fiddler on the Roof, starring Danny Burstein. Do you have a Person of the Year or anything you want to add as we wrap up?
The name I would throw out to be remembered is Yossi Sarid, who died within the last few weeks. One of the great principled leftists of the Israeli political system, and he was always a man of conscience, and he spoke to issues, and he reminded us what is right, and he wasn't correct on everything, but he was a credit to Israel and a credit to Zionism, and I recall him at this moment.
Very lovely.
Well, I also have a person who passed away not so recently, but his biography came out just a few weeks ago, and that's the late Abba Eben, or Aubrey Eben. The biography was written by Asaf Stinover. It's available as a hardcover book, well worth reading. What's important is to remember Eben's uniqueness in the Israeli political spectrum, his ideas, and then the question of how relevant are his ideas today. So I recommend everyone should read it. It's an important chapter of Israeli history that has considerable salience in terms of contemporary Israeli politics.
By the way, since you've mentioned people who've passed away, there's a large number of people we lost tragically. Every year we do. Some are more well-known. Some are known to family. And by the way, you lost your son, Yehuda. And all of us here extend, there's no way we can say enough to you. Your son was 31 years old. He was about to be married. He was a lovely, lovely person. And I know how close he was to you personally. And so there's no way to say anything other than it is one of the human tragedies of life, and we are with you
thanks.
profoundly.
And the outpouring of support we've received from all sectors of the Jewish world, from the Haredi right to the Reform non-affiliated, has been incredibly gratifying.
That is lovely to hear, Steve.
You are very much beloved, Steve. You should know this.
But in addition to Yehuda Bayme, Leonard Nimoy from Star Trek fame, and are you old enough to remember Bess Meyerson?
Sure.
Of course, yeah.
Miss America.
The first
Jewish
Miss America.
Miss America, and also
Girlfriend to Ed Koch.
Helped get Ed Koch elected.
yes, and was a major figure in New York City politics.
And a powerful symbol of Jewish identity in the
Right.
post-war era.
Yes, and then Dolph Shays. Who was Dolph Shays?
Basketball player.
First great Jewish basketball star. He held the record for most points ever scored over a lifetime until he was eclipsed by Bob Pettit, who in turn was eclipsed by Wilt Chamberlain, who in turn was eclipsed by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
But he was the first great scorer.
That's
in
right.
He was
NBA.
That's
the first
great.
person to score 15,000 points.
That's right.
You know your Dolph Shays. I'm very impressed. Okay, Al Rosen. Do you know who Al Rosen is?
Cleveland Indians.
Cleveland
Got
Indians.
questions on these.
Listen,
Did he win a batting title? I think he might have.
I'm
Yes.
not sure of. I thought it was an MVP title.
He MVP for
Right.
Cleveland Indians,
Right.
and he was a baseball executive. I'll mention two in the Jewish world. Do you know who Samuel Pisar was? An author, Holocaust survivor of Blood and Hope, a marvelous writer and a lovely human being. And Bernice Tenenbaum passed away.
I worked with Bernice when I was at Hadassah 35 years ago.
The former president of
She
Hadassah.
lived till 99. An
A
incredible,
remarkable person, yes.
remarkable person, tower of strength in the Jewish world.
Yes. And then, of course, we lost a real icon in the entertainment world, Theodore Bickel.
It's interesting that Wagon Train, I just saw this a few nights ago, in 1962 had an episode featuring Theodore Bickel. He came across as such a nice Jewish man, very talented in terms of
hired
song, but incredibly charitable towards children in particular. And I said, this is like paradise. The Jew has arrived as the nice person.
Yes. And in many ways, that's who he represented. And he did it in multiple arenas. He was stage, he was screen, he was television, and of course he was a folk singing icon
Also a political activist.
And a political activist.
Generally speaking, on the left.
Yes, absolutely.
Involved in merits.
And also involved in the Soviet Jewry movement in the early days.
So if you want to have a real laugh, go rent again. The Russians are coming. The Russians are coming.
Yes.
And see it again with your old perspective as the height of the Cold War, and today how funny that movie is.
And speaking of Fiddler on the Roof, Theo Bickel had the running record of the longest performances as Tevye.
Oh, really?
Yes. So it's a nice way to end. It has been wonderful to share these two programs with you. The four of you are just, the Hebrew was Yotzei Min HaKlal. You're all outstanding. Betty, I can't tell you how much it meant to me. You made sure you were here for this program. I needed you in that chair. That's your chair. So thank you.
It's my pleasure.
And then you're my sidekick, The only time you're not here is when you can't be here.
I live for it.
That's
one of the things I look forward to.
I can't thank
I'm in the bullpen waiting for the Golub call.
Okay, and Eric, you and I go way back, and I treasure our friendship, and I think you one of the most important voices on the world Jewish scene, and I always want you sitting next to me and sitting in this chair. And Steve, I will never do a show here without you, and you're extraordinary, and the insight and the perspective. And it's interesting, I'm listening to you, and when the audience watches, it's not like the four of you are at each other. And what I've really tried to get is people with different perspectives, but all within a, for lack of a better phrase, a centrist perspective. What I mean by that is, whether you lean right or whether you lean left, you care passionately about the Jewish people, the Jewish future, the state of Israel, the well-being of Torah in the lives of all of Amcha, and the fact that you also care so much about JBS and you're willing to take the time. And people should understand nobody gets paid here. These people take time from their lives to come and speak to you and share their insight with us and let me push them and prod them, and I beg them to come, and they always say yes, and they make it easy for me. But I can't thank you enough. I can't thank you enough. I can't thank you enough.
Thank you.
Our pleasure to be here.
Our pleasure.
We would never refuse you, Mark. It's not that we're just here to talk to the Jewish community. We are indeed here to also talk to you.
Thank you very, very much. Here you have it. Remarkable people ending the year with us as we review the year 2015. We hope you've enjoyed hearing the thoughts, the insights, the memories of Steve Bayme, Eric Yoffie, Betty Ehrenberg, and Thane Rosenbaum. Of course, as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts. To anything discussed on our L'Chayim Roundtables or on anything else you think of importance you'd like us to think about ourselves in 2015, please email me, write me, post on our Facebook page, or tweet me. I always enjoy reading your comments. And of course, all of us here at the round table, and all of us who bring you JBS, hope that every one of you have a lovely end to calendar year 2015, and we hope you know only health and joy in 2016. And may it be a year of peace for us, for all the people of Israel, and for women, children, and men everywhere on earth. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'Chayim, my friends, to life.
L'Chayim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.